The sound came first, a low, hungry hum that cut through the humid morning air like a rusty blade. It wasn't the sound of plane, nor the familiar roar of artillery we'd learned to map in our mind, pinpointing distance and danger with grim precision. It was something different, more intimate, closer. The sound of branches snapping under the weight of boots that weren't ours. The rustle of leaves that wasn't caused by the wind. The sound of predator closing in on prey. And we, the 17th platoon of Baker Company, the prey. We were soaked, muddy to the bone, traversing a dense forest somewhere near the border the maps called safe. The maps lied. Safety was an illusion, a story we told ourselves on cold nights to ward off the specter of fear. That day, the specter came to collect. The first shot wasn't a bang, but a dry, almost harmless crack. It was the sound of Private Miller's head from Ohio, snapping back as if someone had pulled an invisible string attached to his chest. He fell without a groan, his helmet rolling to the side with a dull thud in the mud. For a millisecond, the universe froze. We watched his body fall, the surprise in his young eyes turning to glassy emptiness before he even hit the ground. And then hell swallowed us. The air filled with a chorus of automatic rifle fire, the buzzing sounds transforming into a swarm of deadly hornets that tore at trees and flesh with equal indifference. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. They were ghosts in the mist, figures moving through the trees with a terrifying efficiency born of their knowledge of the terrain. We were intruders, clumsy and noisy in his house. I was thrown to the ground by the force of a nearby explosion, the world turning into a blur of green and brown. The earth shook and embraced me, the smell of damp soil, gunpowder, and fresh blood filling my nostrils. The metallic taste of fear filled my mouth. My ears rang, drowning out the screams of my comrades. They were screams of pain, of surprise, of men calling for their mothers with their last breath. I clung to my rifle, the cold, familiar metal against my cheek, but I could see nothing. Only shadows and the intermittent flash of gunfire coming from all sides. I remember thinking, in a strangely lucid way, that this was what an animal felt like in a trap. The confusion, the helplessness, the absolute, overwhelming certainty that the end had come. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the noise ceased. The silence that followed was heavier, more terrifying than any gunfire. It was a silence filled with the dripping of rain on leaves, the low groans of the wounded, and the sound of my own breathing, labored and irregular. I slowly raised my head, mud running down my face. I saw bodies scattered about, friends with whom I had shared rations and jokes just hours before, now motionless, their stories cut off mid-sentence. And I saw the boots, dirty, worn boots, surrounding me. Rough hands grabbed me, turning me onto my back with brutal force. A knee pressed into my back, pinning me to the earth that drank the blood of my brother. I felt the cold barrel of a rifle on the back of my neck. A voice shouted something in a language I didn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. Surrender or die. In that moment, under the grey, indifferent sky, I was no longer a soldier. I was cargo. I was a prisoner. And as they dragged me through the forest, past the empty faces of my dead friend, I knew the battle for my life had only just begun, but the war for my soul was already lost. What I was about to see, the place they were taking me to, was a dark hole in the face of the earth, a place where hope went to die and men forgot they were ever human. My name is Jack Riley. Today, I'm an old man whose hands tremble when holding a cup of coffee, whose knees crack like dry twigs with every step. I have 93 years of stories etched into the wrinkles on my face, but I keep most of them to myself. People don't want to hear the real story. They want to hear about heroism and mettle, about good overcoming evil in a glorious explosion. The truth is much dirtier and quieter. The truth smells like the mud of that forest in Europe, somewhere near the German border, in the fall of 1940. I was 19.19, barely a man. But the United States Army gave me a rifle, a helmet, and a one-way ticket to hell, telling me it would make me. They were wrong. It nearly tore me apart. Before I was a prisoner number, before I was a soldier, I was just Jack, from a small town in Pennsylvania called Harmony. An ironic name, now that I think about it. There was nothing harmonious about what the world was becoming. Harmony Creek was the kind of place you see in old postcards. A main street with a drugstore, a single-screen movie theater, and a diner where the smell of fries and milkshakes clung to the air. Our house was on Elm Street, a small white clapboard house with a front porch and a yard big enough for our dog, Buddy, a yellow mutt with a heart as big as the world. My father, Thomas Riley, was the silence and strength of the house. He spent his days at the steel mill, coming home with the smell of metal and sweat in his clothes, his thick, calloused hands capable of fixing anything. He didn't talk much about feeling, but he showed his love in other ways, teaching me how to pitch a baseball until my arm ached, showing me how to check the oil in our old Ford, or simply with a proud nod when I brought home a good report card. He was my North Star, the rock on which my little world was built. My mother, Clara, was the heart of the house. She orchestrated our lives with a symphony of small gestures. The smell of her bread baking on Saturday morning, the sound of her sewing machine mending my worn jeans, the way she hummed along to the radio as she prepared dinner. Her cooking was simple but tasted like home: beef stew, roast chicken, and a legendary apple pie, which seemed to cure any sadness. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the heat from the stove warming my back, as she told me stories about her own childhood. The house was always filled with her warmth, a fortress against the cold of the outside world. I had a younger sister, Lucy, whose braids I was always pulling and whose laughter filled the quietest corners of the house. Life was made up of these moments: family dinners, board games on rainy nights, the fight over who would use the bathroom first in the morning. It was such an ordinary, everyday thing that I never stopped to consider how precious it was. It was like the air I breathed, essential, but invisible, until the day I found myself suffocating from the lack of it. And then there was Sarah. Sarah was my summer, hair as blonde as August corn and eyes as blue as the June sky. We grew up together. Our first kiss was behind the bleachers of the school football field, awkward and electric. We spent hours lying on the grass in the park, staring at the clouds, talking about everything and nothing. We talked about the future as if it were a yellow brick road, a magical path guaranteed to lead us to a house with a white picket fence and to children. I would go to state college, maybe study to be an engineer, like my father had always dreamed. She wanted to be a teacher. We planned everything with the invincible certainty of youth, the naive belief that our dreams were bulletproof. The war, for us, was something distant. Headlines in the newspaper that my father read with a somber expression, worried voices on the radio. It wasn't us. It couldn't be. But war has a way of knocking on your door, no matter how locked it is. One day, the draft posters appeared in town. Uncle Sam pointed his finger at us from every lamppost, every storefront. My friends started enlisting. There was a fever in the air, a mix of fear and excitement. It was our duty, they said. It was the great adventure of our generation. I didn't want to go. The thought of leaving my mother, my father, Lucy, and especially Sarah, dug a cold hole in my stomach. But the fear of being called a coward was even greater. Then, on a sunny spring afternoon, I walked into the recruiting station. I remember the night before I left for basic training. My mother cooked my favorite dinner. No one said much. The silence was heavy with unspoken words. My father gave me an awkward but strong hug and whispered in my ear, "Just come home, son. Come home." Sarah gave me a small medallion of Saint Christopher, the protector of travelers, to keep you safe, she said, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to shed. I held it tightly. At that moment, it felt stronger than any bulletproof vest. I was young, full of bravado that barely concealed the terror beneath. I thought war was about fighting for what I loved, my home, my family, my future with Sarah. But in that cold, dark forest, as enemy hands bound me and pushed me toward an unknown fate, I realized the terrible irony. To fight for that world, I had to leave it behind, and I had no idea if I would ever find my way back. The march was the first lesson, the first of many, about how the human body can become a prison. Our captors treated us not with the explosive brutality of an attack, but with something far worse, a cold, calculated indifference, like that of a farmer driving cattle to the slaughterhouse. We were tied together with rough ropes that bit into our wrists with every jolt. The wounded, those who moaned softly or stumbled more frequently, received special treatment, a rifle butt to the back to hurry them along, or, if their slowness became a burden, a single, echoing shot that silenced their complaints forever. We quickly learned to swallow the pain, to transform our groans into silent, gasping breath. We learned to lean on each other, not out of camaraderie, but out of pure survival instinct, one body helping the other stand so the sound of that shot wouldn't reach them. The chill of the European forest, once a mere discomfort, now seeped into our bones. Our coats and gear had been left behind in the rush of the ambush, leaving us with only our thin, sodden uniforms, useless armor against the biting wind that howled through the trees like an omen. After hours that stretched into an eternity, we arrived at a makeshift, little more than a muddy clearing surrounded by barbed wire and grumpy guards. We were herded into a line, our exhausted bodies barely able to sustain themselves. Hunger, once a distant pang, was now a sharp, constant ache in my stomach, an animal gnawing at my inside. And it was there that the second lesson began, the annihilation of who we were. An officer with a pale face and empty eyes walked down the line, accompanied by a soldier carrying a canvas sack. The officer wouldn't look us in the eye. He stared at our hands, our necks, our pockets. He was a thief of memory. One by one, he and his aides stripped us of everything that connected us to the world we had lost. Watches, wallet, yellowed photographs of wives and children, letters from home, the paper soft from being read and reread. Everything went into the bag, a black hole that swallowed our identity. I watched, my heart hammering against my ribs, a rhythm of pure panic. My hand instinctively went to my chest, feeling the cold, familiar outline of the St. Christopher medallion Sarah had given. It was my only piece of home, my only tangible connection to the promise of a future, to the warmth of the Pennsylvanias. It was my talisman, the silent proof that I was Jack Wright, that I loved a girl named Sarah, and that I had a place in the world to return. The officer approached. He didn't say a word. He just held out his gloved hand. I didn't move. For a moment of pure insanity, I considered resisting. But then I saw his gaze, devoid of all emotion, and the soldier beside him, his hand resting on his weapon with fright. And no, here wouldn't be an act of defiance. It would be suicide. Slowly, with fingers trembling and clumsy from the cold, I pulled the cord over my head. The small metal disc felt like it weighed a ton in the palm of my hand. For an instant, I saw Sarah's face in my mind, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "To keep you safe," she had said. I placed it in the officer's outstretched hand. He didn't even glance at it. He simply tossed it into the bag with the rest of the confiscated lives and moved on to the next, as if he had just collected a piece of trash. In that moment, a different kind of cold invaded me, a cold that came from within, an icy emptiness that the hottest sun could never warm again. They hadn't just taken a piece of metal. They had stolen my hope. The final humiliation of that first day came with the food. After hours of waiting in the biting cold, as the sky darkened to a deep purple, we watched the guards gather round a fire. The smell of hot stew and bread wafted toward us, a delicious torture that made our stomachs twist in agony. They laughed, chattered in their guttural tongue, steam rising from their metal bowl. For us, there were no bowl. A guard approached with a steaming cauldron and a bucket. What he gave us wasn't food. It was a thin, grayish mush, with a few chunks of potato floating sadly in the liquid. He didn't use a ladle. He used the bucket to scoop the mixture into a dirty wooden trough, as if feeding pigs. We were pushed toward the trough, and the men round me, men who had fought bravely hours before, fell to their knees in the mud, cupping their hands to scoop the lukewarm, dirty water into them. Hungover came pride. Hungover came humanity. I knelt too. The porridge tasted of earth and despair. As I ate, I saw one of the younger guard, a boy who looked no older than me, watching. He finished his bread, leaving a small piece. Our eyes met. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of pity on his face. He then tossed the piece of bread toward me, but he didn't throw it into my hand. He tossed it into the mud puddle beside me. He smiled, a small, cruel smile, before turning away. In that instant, The pain of hunger was replaced by a wave of hatred so pure and intense it left me breathless. I didn't take the bread. Kneeling in the mud, with the taste of ash in my mouth, I finally understood. We weren't the enemy. We were less than that. We were sport, an inconvenient, a form of entertainment for them. We were animals in a cage, and the first lesson of captivity was to learn to forget that we had once been men. The makeshift camp in the forest was only the vestibule to hell. The real hell was a place with a name, Stalag X, and it had the grim permanence of a city built for the dead. We were transported there in cattle cars, stacked so tightly it was impossible to sit down. For 2 days, we sat in the dark, jolted by the movement of the train, breathing the stale air tainted with the smell of fear, sweat, and the waste we had nowhere to dispose of. The sound of the wheels on the tracks was a constant hammer, pounding on our souls with each kilometer that took us further and further from everything we knew. When the doors finally opened, daylight blinded us. The first thing I saw wasn't a building or a person, but geometry. Straight, unforgiving lines of barbed wire stretched across double fences that rose against a grey, hopeless sky. Watchtowers dotted the perimeter like wooden vultures, and within the enclosure, black wooden sheds lined up in perfect, desolate. The ground wasn't grass, or even dirt. It was perpetual mud, compacted by the feet of thousands of men who had already lost hope long before we arrived. Dogs barked, guards shouted, and the wind carried with it a smell I'll never forget, a sweet, rancid mixture of boiled cabbage, disease, and chimney smoke. It was the smell of institutionalized hopelessness. Life at Stalag XP was a routine designed to grind a man to powder. Each day began before dawn, with the shrill sound of a whistle piercing the fragile silence of the night. We were herded from our wooden bunks, hard planks, where we slept 3 high, huddled together for warmth to the roll courtyard. A peel stood in formation for hours, shivering in the bitter cold of the German dawn, while the guards counted. They were meticulous. They counted the living and the dead. If a man died during the night, his body had to be carried out and placed in formation to be counted, a macabre reminder that even in death, you were still their property. The count was deliberately slow, the form of passive torture. The gods pace, beating the legs with their truncheons against anyone who leaned or wavered. The cold was a physical enemy. It seeped into our tattered clothes, our holy boots, and lodged in our joints, making us feel old and frail. After roll call, we received our coffee, a mug of a dark, hot liquid that tasted like dirty dishwater. It was hot, and for that alone, it was worth drinking. Breakfast was followed by work. The work varied, but its purpose was always the same, to exhaust us. Sometimes we were forced to dig trenches that led nowhere, only to fill them again the next day. Other time, we toiled in a nearby quarry, breaking rocks with heavy sledgehammers until our hands bled and our shoulders screamed in pain. The work was accompanied by a symphony of shouts from the guard, and the dull sound of beatings on those who couldn't keep up. Lunch was the centerpiece of our day, the moment in which our entire existence was concentrated. It was a bowl of soup, always the same then, grey-green soup made of turnip, potatoes, if we were lucky, a stray piece of horseflesh. It tasted like the earth in which the vegetables grew. We sipped it slowly, scraping the metal bowl with our makeshift spoon, trying to make every drop last, trying to outwit the hunger monster that lived permanently in our stomach. Hunger was a physical presence. It weakened us, clouded our thinking, and turned good men into animals. I saw lifelong friends fight over a crust of bread dropped in the mud. I saw men risk certain beatings to steal a raw potato from the kitchen. Hunger erased everything, honor, friendship, decency. Only necessity remained. At night, in the barrack, the darkness brought no relief, only a different kind of torment. The cold was more intense, and the constant sound of coughing echoed in the darkness. The barbed wire cough, as we called it, was the sound of tuberculosis and pneumonia slowly taking life. Men coughed until they coughed up blood, their bodies writhing in their bones. There were no doctors, no medicine. The only cure was death, which came silently in the dead of night. To combat the darkness in our mind, we told stories. In the cold and dim light, we whispered about our lives before the war. A man named Peterson, a farmer from Iowa, described the cornfields of his home in such detail that we could almost feel the sun on our faces. Another, a young man from Boston named O'Connell, talked about taking his girlfriend dancing. They were more than stories. They were spells we cast against despair, a way to remind ourselves that we were more than the numbers tattooed on our arms or sewn into our clothes. Each shared memory was a small act of rebellion, a statement that Stalag XP couldn't have all of us. That's why I'm telling you all this today, so that their story, the story of men like Peterson and O'Connell, isn't lost in silence. They didn't want to die forgotten in a foreign land. They wanted their lives to mean something. If you believe these memories deserve to be heard, that these sacrifices shouldn't be in vain, then I ask you to do something simple. Like this video as a sign that you're listening. Subscribe to our channel to join this digital vigil, to ensure that the echo of their voices never, ever fade. Every click is a flower on the tomb of an unknown soldier. It's our way of keeping the flame of memory burning against the wind of oblivion. As the weeks pass, the horror deepened. Death ceased to be a shock and became an administrative fact. The cart that collected the bodies each morning was as normal a part of our routine as roll call or soup. Our bodies began to betray us. We lost weight until we became skeletons covered in skin. Our gums bled, our teeth loosened from scurvy. Small cuts became infected and turned into open wounds that never healed. The ground shook occasionally with the distant sound of shelling. For some, it was a sound of hope, proof that the war continued and our armies were advancing. For others, it was just another terrifying sound in a world made of terror, a reminder of the violence that could consume us at any moment. The gods, perhaps sensing the pressure of the approaching war, became more cruel. The beatings became more frequent and more brutal. They invented new rules just for the pleasure of punishing us for breaking them. One day, a man was caught trying to smuggle a potato into the shed. They hung him by his wrists from a post in the middle of the yard. He stayed there for 2 days. His screams the first night gave way to low moans the second, and then to silence. We were forced to watch. We were forced to watch him die slowly, like a warning. The message was clear. Hope was contraband, and anyone caught with it would suffer the same fate. The horror was no longer an event. It had become the air we breathe, the food we ate, the very fabric of our existence. And the worst, I felt, the worst was yet to come. There was an abyss opening inside me, a place where the light of Jack Riley, the boy from Pennsylvania, was slowly fading, and I didn't know what would remain when it was completely gone. In that sea of skeletal faces and empty eyes, Danny O'Connell was an anomaly. He was from Boston, fast-talking, and possessed an optimism that should have been crushed in the early days, but which, by some miracle, persisted. He was younger than, and still carried the light of youth in his eyes, a light that hunger and fear could not completely extinguish. We became more than friends. We became each other's anchor in the storm. We shared bread when one of us managed to get a spare piece. We supported each other during roll call so the cold wouldn't overwhelm us, and at night, in our bunk, we whispered about afterward was our gospel. After the war was over, I would return to Pennsylvania to find Sarah. He would return to Boston to marry his fiancée, Mary, a girl whose smile he described with the devotion of a poet. He didn't have a photograph of her, as they had all been confiscated, but he had something better. With a piece of charcoal stolen from the kitchen, he had drawn her on a piece of yellowed packing paper, a treasure he kept hidden in the folds of his straw mattress. The drawing was crude, childish, but to Danny, it was the Mona Lisa. It was Mary's eyes, Mary's smile. It was the promise that the country was real. It was his armor against madness. This armor, however, was fragile. The cruelty at Stalag XP was an acid that corroded everything. The sergeant major commanding the guard was a man named Klaus Richter. He wasn't a soldier, he was a monster in uniform. He had a scarred face and a sadistic pleasure in inventing new ways to break us. He seemed to harbor a particular hatred for any glimmer of humanity he found in us. And Danny's optimism, his refusal to bow completely, seemed to offend him personally. One day, without warning, Richter ordered a general inspection of the barrack. It was an act of pure power theater. We were torn from our tasks and lined up outside in the dirty snow while his men turned our bunks upside down. They ripped apart mattresses, broke our few improvised belongings, a wooden comb, a spare spoon. The goal wasn't to find contraband, was to remind us that nothing was ours, not even an inch of personal space, not even a secret thought. I watched, my heart in my throat, as they approached our bunk. I saw a guard's hand dip into the straw and come out with Danny's small, folded piece of paper. "What is this?" the guard barked. Danny stepped forward, panic etched on his face. "Nothing, sir. It's just a piece of paper." Richter walked over, snatched the paper from the guard's hand, and unfolded it. He looked at the drawing of Mary's smiling face, then back at Danny. A slow, venomous smile spread across his face. "Ah, an artist," he sneered. "Or perhaps a forger, making maps of the camp, prisoner." The accusation was so absurd it was surreal. "No, sir. It's my fiancée. It's just a drawing of her," Danny pleaded, his voice shaking. Richter held up the paper. "Smuggling," he declared with terrible finality, "and insubordination." He signaled to two of his guards. "Take him to the center." What happened next is etched in my memory. They dragged Danny into the middle of the courtyard. The other prisoners were forced to form a circle to watch. It was a lesson, and we were the student. Richter stood before Danny, holding the small drawing between his thumb and forefinger. "Do you like your drawing that much?" he asked with mock curiosity. Danny, tears streaming down his face, simply nodded. "Then you can eat it," Richter said. He shoved the paper into Danny's mouth, forcing him to chew and swallow his beloved's face. I wanted to close my eye. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run and kill that man with my own hand. But I was frozen, paralyzed by terror and the certainty that any movement I made would only result in my own death, and would not save Danny. We were all paralyzed, an audience of ghosts watching a sacrifice. And then, the real punishment began. Richter didn't use a truncheon. He used his boots. The first kick hit Danny in the stomach, causing him to double over, choking on paper and bile. The second hit him in the face, the sound of bone breaking echoing in the deathly silence of the courtyard. They kicked him repeatedly, Richter and his two henchmen. They kicked his then frail body as if they were trying to put out a fire. I could hear Danny's ribs cracking. I could hear the wet sound of the blows on his flesh. But worst of all was when the sound stopped. Danny stopped moaning. His body, previously tense with pain, went limp, inert in the dirty snow. But they didn't stop. They kept kicking his limp body, their faces red with exertion and sick pleasure. Finally, panting, Richter walked away. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he spat, wiping his boot on the snow. "There's nothing for you here. No home, no brides, only the field." He turned and walked away, followed by his men, leaving Danny's broken body behind like a sack of garbage. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence was absolute. Then, slowly, as if waking from a trance, some of us approached. I knelt beside him. His face was unrecognizable, a mass of blood and bruises. But his eyes were open, fixed on the grey sky above us. The light had gone out. That stubborn optimism, that hope that had kept me alive, had been literally trampled to death before my eyes. That night, Danny's bunk was empty. The silence that emanated from that space was louder than any scream. I didn't cry. I couldn't. What I felt was something beyond sadness. It was a cold, heavy emptiness, as if they'd ripped something vital from me and left a gaping hole for the winter wind to blow through. They hadn't just killed an 18-year-old boy from Boston. They'd killed the idea that we could survive with our souls intact. They'd killed the belief in afterward. In the darkness of the shed, surrounded by the sound of the other men's coughs and nightmares, I made a silent promise to Danny's empty bunk. I would survive. I didn't know how, but I would get out of that place. And I would tell the world not just about the cruelty of men like Richter, but about the kindness of men like Danny O'Connor. I would make sure his name, and Mary's name, weren't swallowed up and forgotten like that little charcoal. Danny's death wasn't the beginning of my end. It was the end of my beginning. The boy Jack Riley died with him. What remained was something harder, colder and dangerously focused on one thing, seeing the next sunrise and the next, until I could escape this hell and fulfill my promise. The end began with a sound. For months, the only sound piercing the monotony of the camp was the distant rumble of artillery, a thunder on the horizon that seemed never to get any closer. But that January night in 1945, the sound was different. It was deeper, closer, a vibration we felt in our bones before we even heard it with our ears. The floor of the barrack shook. The sound made the guards agitated, barking orders to each other with barely concealed panic in their voices. The rumor spread through the bunks like wildfire. The Allies were close, very close. For an instant, a spark of dangerous hope lit in the darkness. Perhaps liberation was only a few kilometers away. But hope, in that place, was the cruelest of lies. Instead of liberation, we had Klaus Richter. He broke down the doors of our barracks before dawn, his face contorted into a mask of fury and fear. Out, everyone out. The camp is being evacuated. He shouted, "Grab what you can. They're going for a long walk." There was nothing to catch. We were driven out into the frozen courtyard, where a blizzard howled, turning the world into a blinding white whirlwind. The cold was a knife, cutting through our thin clothes and skin. They lined us up, not in our usual roll call formation, but in a long, awkward column. We were 100, perhaps 1,000, of men from various ships, an army of specters staggering through the snow. The order was given, and the column began to move, exiting through the gates of Stalag XP for the first and last time. There was no joy in leaving that place behind. We were merely exchanging one cage for another, a cage without wall, guarded by winter itself. The death march had begun. The first few hours were a brutal filter. Men who could barely stand for a roll call were now forced to march in deep snow. They began falling almost immediately. The first man I saw fall was an older Frenchman whose name I never learned. He simply stumbled and didn't get up. A guard shouted to him. He didn't respond. We heard a single shot, a sound muffled by the snow, and the column continued, circling his body, which was quickly becoming covered. This scene repeated itself again and again. The gunshots became the soundtrack of our journey, punctuating the monotonous rhythm of our feet dragging in the snow and the relentless howl of the wind. We learned our lesson quickly. To stop was to die. To keep moving was the only law. Hunger was a constant pain, but thirst was worse. The snow around us was abundant, but we were told that eating it would only accelerate hypothermia. Some men, maddened by thirst, didn't resist. They would fall to their knees and stuff handfuls of snow into their mouth, and invariably, an hour or two later, they would be the next to fall and receive the guard's bullet. The days and nights merged into a single white and grey nightmare. There were no rest stops, just a slow, steady rhythm. We slept as we walked, stumbling forward in a stupor, waking only when we bumped into the man in front of us or when a guard shoved us with the butt of his rifle. My world shrank. It was no longer Pennsylvania, or the countryside, or the war. My world became the sight of the back of the man in front of me, the sound of my own labored breathing, the searing pain in my frozen feet. I focused on small things. I counted my steps, 1, 2, 3, up to 100, and then I would start again. I recited the names of the players on my hometown baseball team in my mind. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to keep it from succumbing to the despair that surrounded me. The men round me were no longer people. They were obstacles, staggering bodies that could fall and take me with. The promise I made to Danny O'Connell was a distant echo, a story from another life. Now, there was only survival, naked, ugly, and selfish. At some point, perhaps on the third day, perhaps on the fourth time, had lost all meaning, the man walking beside me, a British soldier named Arthur, began to waver. He was a quiet man who had shown me how to wrap rags around his feet to prevent frostbite. He stumbled, and I instinctively grabbed his arm, trying to keep him upright. "Keep going, Jack," he murmured, his voice sweet. "I can't do it anymore." "You can do it, Arthur. Just one more step," I said, the lie ringing hollow in my own ear. I dragged him for perhaps 100 meters. The effort was inhuman. My own legs trembled violently. A guard approached, shouting for us to hurry. I saw death in his eyes. He wouldn't hesitate to shoot us both. Arthur looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a terrible clarity. Go. Tell them, he whispered. He pulled his arm from mine and let himself fall into the snow. I paused for a second, my heart breaking in my chest. The guard raised his rifle. Go. Arthur shouted, and I did. I turned my back on my friend and kept walking, not looking back, as the sound of the shot echoed behind me. In that moment, I felt the last shard of old Jack Riley crumble to dust. To survive, I had to become a monster. I don't know how much longer I walked after that. Maybe hours, maybe another day. My body was shutting down. I couldn't feel my feet anymore. My vision was narrowing, the world becoming a white tunnel. The scoreboard, the player's name, everything was gone. My mind was blank except for a single, overwhelming certainty. I couldn't take the next. And then I fell. It wasn't a dramatic fall. I simply stopped walking and my legs gave out. I sank into the soft, cold snow. The column continued without me. Within minutes, I was alone in the middle of a white desert. The wind howled, but it seemed distant. A strange warmth began to spread through my body, a treacherous comfort. I knew it was the end, and, to my surprise, I felt peace. It was over. The struggle, the pain, the hunger. It was all over. I closed my eyes. Sarah's image appeared in my mind, her smile in the park on a summer day. My father's voice saying, "Just come home, son." Danny's broken face in the snow. "Tell them," Arthur had said. "I'm sorry," I thought. I tried. And then I surrendered to the darkness, the white silence. But the silence wasn't complete. There was a sound, a low sound, a deep rumble that vibrated through the snow and into my body. Was it the sound of artillery? No, it was different. It was rhythmic, continuous, and it was getting closer. With an effort that felt like the greatest of my life, I opened my eyes. The snow swirled, but through the white veil, I saw something. A large, dark shape moving slowly toward me. And then another, and another. They were tanks, but they weren't German tanks. On their side, blurred by the snow, was a star, a white star. For a moment, I thought I was dead, that it was a final hallucination. The rumble grew louder, deafening, the ground shaking violently. The first tank stopped a few meters away from me. The hatch opened, and a figure dressed in a uniform I knew so well appeared. The man shouted something, but I couldn't understand. His voice was distorted, as if coming from underwater. He was shouting in English, American English. He was shouting at me. Other soldiers jumped from the tank. Their rifles pointed not at me, but at the road, at the panicked guard. One of the soldiers ran toward me, kneeling beside me. He had a young, soot-covered face, and his eyes were wide with horror at the sight of me. "My God," he whispered, "we're here. You're safe now, safe." The word held no meaning. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. He lifted me in his arms as if I weighed nothing, and I truly did. The last thing I felt was the rough texture of his coat against my face, and the smell of gasoline and cigarette smoke. And then, for the first time in months, I allowed myself to pass out, falling not into the darkness of death, but into the uncertainty of survival. The journey home was, in many ways, more surreal than the captivity itself. I was on a ship packed with thousands of soldiers, and the air vibrated with a frenetic, jubilant energy. Men sang, played cards, and shouted with joy with each nautical mile that brought them closer to America. They were returning home, to their lives, to pick up where they had left off. I was among them, a body in uniform, but my soul was a million miles away, still trapped in the white silence of that snowy marsh. I would lean against the ship's rail for hours, staring out at the grey expanse of the Atlantic, and I felt a greater kinship with the empty ocean than with the exultant men round. They had won the war. I felt I had lost something far more fundamental, the ability to belong to the world I was returning. I was no longer a piece of the puzzle of normal life. The war had sanded my edges, changed my shape, and I knew, with terrifying certainty, that I would never fit in it. When the train finally whistled at Harmony Creek Station, I saw them on the platform. My father, looking older, his hair graying at the temple. My mother, her face a map of anxiety and relief, twisting a handkerchief in her hand. and Sarah, standing a little behind them, beautiful as the last memory I had of her, but with a new maturity in her eyes. The moment I stepped off the train should have been the climax of my story, the return of the hero. But it was silent, strained. My mother's embrace was desperate, as if she were trying to fuse me back into her body, to protect me from the world that had nearly taken me. My father's embrace was firm, his shoulder trembling slightly under my tongue, and Sarah's embrace was hesitant, careful. They were embracing a ghost. I could feel it. I could see in their eyes that they were searching for the Jack they had known, the boy who told bad jokes and dreamed of being an engineer. But he was no longer there. In his place was a quiet, thin stranger whose eyes could not meet theirs for a long time. The days that followed were a torture of kindness. My mother cooked feasts, filling my plate with portions that would have fed 5 prisoners for a week. The sight of such abundance made me nauseous. I ate slowly, mechanically, each bite a reminder of the thin soup and moldy bread. People from the town came to visit, patted me on the back, called me a hero. They asked me questions I couldn't answer. Was it hard in there? They asked. How could I put into words the image of Danny being beaten to death for a drawing? How could I explain the brutal logic of leaving a friend to die in the snow to save oneself? The words I had didn't fit their reality, so I just nodded. Yes, it was hard, and they were content with that, content with the simplified version of history that allowed them to continue their peaceful life. I became a master of silence, a keeper of terrible secrets locked in my own childhood bedroom, which now felt like a movie set, a place where I no longer belonged. The turning point came not with a scream, but with a whisper. It was a few weeks after my return. I couldn't sleep, as usual. The house was quiet. The city was quiet, but the noise in my head was deafening. I went downstairs and out into the backyard. The night was clear, full of stars. I sat on the porch swing my father built, the same place I used to sit with Sarah. And there, in the silence of the American night, I finally allowed myself to fall apart. The tears came, silent and hot. I didn't cry for the pain or the fear I felt. I cried for the men who weren't there to see those stars. I cried for a Miller, the first to fall. I cried for Peterson and his stories of the cornfield. I cried for Arthur, who asked me to tell the world. And most of all, I cried for Danny O'Connell and the drawing of his Mary, which was turned to ash and pain. And it was in that moment, in that baptism of pain, that the lesson finally crystallized. The catharsis. I understood that I survived for a reason. It wasn't luck. It wasn't because I was stronger, smarter. It was random, brutally random. But the meaning of my survival wasn't in the event itself, but in what I would do next. My life was no longer just mine. It was a living memorial. I was the keeper of their story. The promise I made in Danny's empty barn, others' last request in the snow, weren't burden. They were my new purpose. War didn't teach me about glory, honor, or patriotism. Those are big, empty words, used by men who have never smelled gangrene or heard a friend cry for his mother. War taught me the truth about humanity, at its ugliest and most beautiful extreme. I saw Rector's capacity for cruelty, a malice so pure it seemed otherworldly. And I saw Danny's capacity for hope, a light so stubborn that not even hell could completely extinguish only his body. The true lesson, the moral of my entire story, was frighteningly simple. In the end, when everything is taken from you, your home, your food, your dignity, your name, the only thing left, the only thing that defines whether you're still human, are the small connections. A piece of bread shared, a story whispered in the dark, the promise to remember a name. Heroism wasn't in killing the enemy. It was in looking at another man suffering and seeing yourself. It was in refusing to let their hatred transform you into one of them. My war didn't end when I was freed. It simply changed battlefield. The fight now wasn't for survival, but for memory. My mission was to ensure those men hadn't died in vain, that their names weren't just statistics in a history book. I had to live a life that honored their sacrifice. Not a grand life, but a good life, a life in which I would be reminded, every day, of the true price of peace and the immeasurable value of a simple act of kindness. I returned to Harmony Creek, but a part of me remained forever buried in the German snow. I married Sarah, We had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and I watched them grow up and have children of their own. I worked for 40 years in the same steel mill as my father, building things, fixing things. From the outside, I was the very image of the American dream they told me I was fighting to protect. I had the house with the white picket fence, the steady job, the loving family. I kept every promise I made to myself in the darkness of that shed. But it was all a performance, a role I learned to play very well. I smiled at Sunday barbecue, cheered at my children's baseball game, held Sarah's hand as we grew old together. But inside, I was always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the whistle to blow, feeling the phantom chill in my bones. The war never left me. It became a silent companion. It was there on nights when I woke in a cold sweat, Richter's face floating in the darkness of my room. It was there in the long winter, when the sound of the wind howling outside transported me back to the marsh. It was there at the dinner table, when I cut the bread and couldn't help but wonder how we would have divided it into 6, 10 pieces. My children never understood why I insisted they clean their plate, why I was quiet and distant at times. Sarah understood, or at least tried. She saw the haunting in my eyes, even when I smiled. She learned to live with the ghost that slept beside her in bed. She loved what was left of me, and for that grace I will be eternally grateful. In the camp, in our darkest moment, when hunger and despair threatened to wipe us out completely, we had a small ritual. We whispered the names of our towns to each other. Harmony Creek, Pennsylvania. Boston, Massachusetts. Des Moines, Iowa. San Antonio, Texas. They were more than just place names. They were incantation. They were proof that we existed elsewhere, that we were more than the numbers on our clothes, that we had a home, a story. Saying the name of your town was like lighting a small candle in the middle of a hurricane. It was an act of faith, in honor of all the homes those men carried in their heart, the only treasures the gods could not confiscate. I ask you to do something further. Write the name of your town, your home, in the comments below. Let's fill this space with the names of the places they defended, the places they could never return. Let every city name be a tombstone for a forgotten soldier, a testament that the idea of home is something worth fighting and dying for. Today, I am an old man, and the world I know is disappearing. Most of the men I served with are gone. The camp, Stalag X, is probably just a green field now, the earth covering the scars, hiding the bone. People read about war in books and see it in movies, but they don't know that. They don't know its silence, its smell, the weight it leaves behind on a man's soul. They don't understand that war doesn't end when the shooting stops. Sometimes I think I didn't survive that march in the snow. Maybe the real Jack Riley died there, in that white desert, lying beside his friend Arthur. Maybe what came home was just his shadow, an echo, charged with a final mission of witness. I lived a long life. I saw the world change in ways I could never have imagined. But in the end, my inner world remained the same, a prison camp surrounded by barbed wire, where I still stand guard over the memory of the men I left behind. I didn't come back from that war. I just learned to breathe outside of it.